Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting lecture of online learning about World War II. But before we begin the fun and excitement, my son Matthew wanted to say hi to you all, and he wanted to say one important lesson that you should all remember about history.
Where the Revolution War started, 1776.
Very good, Matthew. Outstanding. And the other person I think you guys wanted to meet was my dog, Charlie. Hey, Charlie, come here. Charlie, come. Here's Charlie. Let's see if I can get you to see him here. Oh, Charlie, you're a big oaf. Here's Charlie. Charlie says hi. Charlie, look, you're on TV. Yeah.
Charlie, look, everyone's watching.
Everyone's watching you, Charlie. Okay, go on. Okay, you guys have fun.
Woo!
Bye, Charlie. Okay, so we got that out of the way. Now, the real fun will begin with a continuation of detail on World War II. I know you're really excited about that. Just a couple of things. I'm going to post these as assignments because I really need to track that you're like on this and you're doing something. So if you can click that you completed this or mark as done when I post a lecture or if I post something else, you don't need to physically turn in each of these things to me. I don't have the time to grade all of those right now. I'm just trying to track that you're here, that you're doing something, you're watching the lectures, and you're at least looking at those closing questions as, the essential detail from each of the lectures each day. I would suggest keeping those closing questions kind of like you normally do in a binder. You can print them out, or you can start keeping an online binder if we're going to continue this online learning stuff for a while. But you don't need to turn in one of those completed versions every single day. If that doesn't make sense, feel free to comment on the lecture, ask me another question, but just show that you're here, show that you're doing something, turn it in, and maybe add a comment that says, I printed this out, and that'll work for me. One other thing, I know you're really excited about the book that some of you probably bought in advance. That's our fourth book from Lone Star. It's pretty good, and it goes hand in hand with the stuff that I'm lecturing. So if you were able to read chapter 1 yesterday, you've got a really detailed understanding of all of that content that I was teaching. I plan on using this like a textbook for now, just as a supplemental where I'm not going to assign anything out of this that's going to be turned in, but eventually I might start asking some, say, discussion board style questions. We'll see how long this online learning is going to continue. Right now, try to get the book. I know Amazon buying from them Prime is a little delayed, but there are a ton of used copies that are available, Barnes and Noble, eBay, Aid Books, or you can buy a ebook as well. That would be fine. I'll continue to post a few PDFs until I really get sick of doing that, but I'll try to help you out in the short term here. Sound good? Good to go? Let's continue. So if you recall, we left off with FDR getting reelected. So this was his third consecutive term, winning in 1940. Again, he won in 1932, 36, and now again in 1940. And this was kind of in the context of us getting closer and closer to war. If you recall, prior to this, he was reluctant to show 100% support for our European allies. So we did that cash and carry deal, which was a bit of a loophole in the Neutrality Acts. Well, now that he won re-election, look what he's going to do, the Lendlease Act. This essentially allows us to sell stuff to countries at war again without them paying cash because Europe was going broke. Britain, again, the main defense against the Axis, they were holding on by a shoestring. They didn't have much money left. And FDR recognized and understood that we needed to help out our neighbor. He, in fact, said helping out Britain was like lending your neighbor a garden hose when their house is on fire. Well, they were definitely on fire with a daily bombing from the Nazis. So we're now able to lend them all sorts of military supplies, and it's not in violation of the neutrality acts. Now, the isolationists, those in opposition to this, said it's like lending somebody chewing gum. You don't want that back once it's all chewed up, just like you don't want a tank back once it's blown up. So again, there is still opposition out there, but FDR won his third term. He's got a whole lot of power as president, and it's our clear theme now of helping out the allies. Send guns, not sons, billions, not bodies, and we do essentially become the arsenal of democracy at this time, sending some $50 billion overseas. That was a significant amount of money, and that essentially is going to put us out of the depression as well, because sending all of this stuff to Europe, everyone's going to have a job. So just kind of think of that, the depression, it's basically ending with all of this spending here. As for how much we spend, I wouldn't test you on any of that, but just look, our big friend, the Brits, they get the bulk of this money, but we are sending it just about everywhere. Soviet Union, France, China, other European countries, South America, some $50 billion in total. And our spending, to put in perspective, will continue after World War II as well, if you do vaguely recall that Marshall Plan that maybe world history taught you. If not, I'll teach it to you next week. All right, we're getting closer and closer to war. That's the theme. We're in 1940. We're still not officially at war. We're just getting closer to war. And this whole Atlantic Charter, that's pictured here with FDR, with the British Prime Minister. And you can kind of ask yourself, do I remember that new British Prime Minister? It's not Neville Chamberlain. It's not Mr. Appeasement. This is the tough British Prime Minister that says we will defend our island, whatever the cost may be, as Winston Churchill. So FDR and Winston Churchill, they meet in the Atlantic Ocean and they discuss post-war goals. I kind of explain this as like another 14 points. Remember Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? It's basically a similar theme. So we're talking about it even though we're not officially in the war yet. In addition, our warships are now escorting these Lend-Lease ships across the Atlantic. Does that mean we're at war? We're escorting these ships across the Atlantic, and do you think the Nazis are just going to allow our warships to peacefully go across the Atlantic? No, they sink some of our ships. They do kill Americans. In fact, look at this one, the USS Reuben James, about 100 people died on it. Now, do we go to war as a result of this? You're thinking, wait a minute, no. We go to war for something else. Another country will attack us in Hawaii, and you probably do remember that. But keep in mind, we are essentially at war, but it's like another quasi-war, if that makes sense to you. It's an undeclared war in the Atlantic. Our warships are shooting at them. They're shooting at us. Americans are dying. We're just not officially at war with the Nazis yet. Make sense? Hope so. Nothing to really note here other than the big question of when it's a true turning point in our foreign policy. So if you think your way through this, remember the 1920s, we go totally isolated. We continue our isolation, we disarm, we even ban war in like 1928. What's the turning point that pulls us out of it? Is it cash and carry? Is it our peacetime draft? Is it the Lend-Lease Act? Is it the Atlantic Charter? Is it our virtual war in the Atlantic? I would say all of these are gradual turning points, but there is the big one. And when you hear December 7th, 1941, is something jumping out to you? It definitely should. December 7th, 1941, 100% is going to be our turning point. So just kind of understand that this will pull us out of isolation. This will force us to declare war on Japan. And I'm hoping that you can tell that story. So tell the story from World War I to 1945, and you're going to be in good shape. As for this, maybe you recently saw the movie Midway with me. They did a decent job depicting the attack on Pearl Harbor. There are several other movies about Pearl Harbor, one of which is that weird love story movie. I don't really recommend that one. Tora, Tora, Tora. If you have some time at home and you want to watch a good movie on Pearl Harbor, that would be the best. So anyway, the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was a bit of a surprise. Now here's the thing: we knew that an attack was coming somewhere. We had cracked their naval code. We had some code breaking material. We had lost track of the Japanese fleet. We just didn't think they were going to get all the way to Hawaii. Yet there were a whole lot of warning signs of that being possible. So just understand that it happens December 7th, 1941. Over 2,000 Americans die. In the defense of Pearl Harbor, one notable American stands out. This is Dory Miller. He's an African American, the hero of Pearl Harbor, who was actually assigned to mess hall work, cafeteria work. And while ships are being sunk and the Japanese are attacking, he was able to man one of these defense guns and shoot at the Japanese, even though he was not technically in that part of the military. So Dory Miller stands out. He's oftentimes depicted in a lot of these Pearl Harbor movies. He's a name that I would ask that you remember. As for the Japanese admiral that plans this entire thing, there's Yamamoto. And Yamamoto, he kind of was aware that attacking the United States might be problematic. There's his famed quote, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." Yeah, we were the sleeping giant. We were definitely awake after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the attack comes December 7th, 1941. We declare war on December 8th, 1941. And when we declare war on Japan, then Germany declares war on us, and we are 100% in the fight. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Just again, see if you can explain how we go from neutral to banning war to gradually getting back in the fight. I'm hoping that you can tell that story from World War I all the way up through December 7th, 1941, or December 8th, when Roosevelt's signing this declaration of war message. Now we need to zero in on what's happening on the home front, because there will be some major issues on the home front, meaning in the United States, involving women. I think you've seen this picture before. You might know that's the symbolic Rosie the Riveter, because think about it, all the men go off and fight. Who's going to work the factories? Who's going to build the tanks and planes and ships? Women will step up in their kind of new powerful role. Now I know you're asking yourself, does this mean women get full equality and have all the power that they wanted ever since Abigail Adams said, "Remember the ladies"? What do you think is going to happen in the 1950s? You'll see when the men come back from war that there will be kind of a push back into the home, more of that Republican motherhood cult of domesticity that we've seen ever since all of history here. As for African Americans, we'll see how World War II definitely changes things for them. I would say it kickstarts the civil rights movement, simply put, with African Americans. Mexican Americans. You remember how these guys were repatriated in the 1930s during the Depression? Well, now they're going to be asked to come back, yet there is some lingering racism. More on that in a second. Native Americans, how are they going to do? They actually play a very significant role in the war. Maybe you've seen the movie Code Talkers. I know some of you are big Nick Cage fans. He's kind of a bad actor in a movie where his job is to protect the Navajo Indian. We use the Navajo language as code because the Axis could never break that. So there's a, I guess, decent movie depicting that whole thing with Native Americans really patriotically supporting the United States. And there were Native American battalions as well that fought in this. How are Japanese Americans going to do? This, I think you know, more on it in a second, but the Japanese Americans will essentially be imprisoned. So that's one of our infamous decisions at home. We thought that they would be linked with the enemy, so we basically imprisoned all. And history was not too kind in remembering the violation of civil liberties on that front. As for Jewish Americans, why might they have a notable role? Are they able to bring a lot of help to the Jewish refugees? They try, but our borders were shut. So a lot of the Jews trying to seek asylum were not able to come over. And lastly, German or Italian Americans. We don't see the anti-German hatred that we did during World War One, mainly because these guys were like assimilated by this point. So just kind of think the hatred in World War II will more so be directed at Japanese Americans. Yes, there were some prisoners for like vocal Germany supporters or Mussolini supporters, but for the most part, everyone goes anti-Japanese, and I'll show you some of that propaganda in a bit. As for African Americans and civil rights, military is segregated. So our military, by the way, is not going to be integrated black and white until the 1950s, the Korean War. But the military was segregated at this point, and A. Philip Randolph is going to lead a notable march on Washington. He's going to call for, hundreds of thousands of African Americans to march on Washington in defiance of the segregated military policies. And do you guys at all remember that FDR was reluctant to act on civil rights? He didn't want to lose the support of the white Southern Democrats. So he kind of listened to his wife in terms of civil rights, but he didn't really do anything. This is his first response. So the first really notable thing he does for civil rights is the FEPC, Fair Employment Practice Commission, where he eliminates discrimination in any of the defense industry. So it's a notable thing of progress for African Americans, and you can say momentum is building for African Americans during this, yet they still want more. So they're going to be calling for a double V campaign, V for victory, victory over racism and victory over fascism. So think, Hitler's the fascist, calling for a double victory over Hitler and racism. Will they achieve it? Well, not immediately after the war, but the 1950s will definitely kickstart civil rights progress with Martin Luther King in like 1955. So we're getting closer and closer to the civil rights movement with all the notable changes that will happen. That's really one of the first steps by government, though. So we're out of that nadir of race relations in the 20s, and we're seeing some progress here. This depicts the Great Migration, which I've covered before. A lot of jobs are going to open up in the north, so African Americans are going to move to these new factory jobs in the north. And you can see the city population, notable African Americans moving to the north. As for Mexican Americans, we have something called the Bracero Program. I was covering this more like the roller coaster ride of our immigration policy, where if you recall that, Ellis Island back in the day, our doors were open, you want over, you come over. Then the 1920s were like shutting our doors, and in the 1930s, we even kicked out Mexican Americans. Well, now that a whole lot of people are, needed to work the farms and feed the soldiers, we ask for like 5 million Mexican laborers. And they do come over, they work a lot of the fields in the South. Are they treated nicely and fairly? Are these guys paid a whole lot of money? No, conditions are going to be rough. And there's the really terrible Zoot suit riot. A lot of Mexican Americans wore Zoot suits, as you see right here. This would be like a loose fitting suit, where they say the trend in the World War II years was to wear tight-fitting clothing because you'd save fabric. Fabric was essential for the war. Yet Mexican Americans had this kind of style preference. So you got the history of racism. You've got the break in the clothing norm. A bunch of white sailors beat up Mexican Americans in California. That's the famed Zoot suit riot. There's a song about it. It shows that while we are asking for laborers, there's still racism and there's still problems with, immigration and acceptance of immigrants in the 1940s. To be continued on that. As for Japanese Americans, 110,000 are going to be interned. That essentially means imprisoned, where it's all along the West Coast with the belief that they were going to sabotage, they were going to spy, they were going to be loyal to Japan for some reason. So they're all rounded up. This was an executive order by FDR, and the Supreme Court said it was okay. The famed Korematsu versus United States ruling said internment is okay in wartime. And if you guys at all recall, anytime we're at war, civil liberties seem to be taken away. We can go as near term as things like the Patriot Act, or you can go all the way back to like John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Act. If we're at war, civil liberties seem to be taken away. So this was a notable one where Japanese Americans, again, people born in the United States, American citizens, they've got businesses, homes, whatever, they're rounded up and put into prison for the remainder of the war. And as for their, constitutional amendments, this one shows that the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, all violated. Did the government ever apologize for this? Yes, in the 1980s we did. In the 1980s, we eventually issued like a little bit of money for all of the survivors that were still alive in the 1980s. And I say a little bit, I don't have the exact amount, but it was maybe like $20,000 or $30,000. So it was like, whoops, sorry we did that. We were wrong for violating those 5 amendments. Again, these internment camps, some would live in like horse stalls. Former horse stalls converted for temporary occupation. It's not all that pleasant living in those. And now you're also thinking, well, what's this? How to tell Japs from the Chinese? Yes, there was, racism in the United States with some people beating up people because they would simply think that they were, Japanese or loyal to Japan. So you see this guy here, it says, me Chinese, please no Jap. And then Life magazine was even depicting like, this is how you can determine the difference between someone who's Japanese or Chinese. China was our ally in World War II. We were helping them fight against fight against Japan. And later we'll help our friends in China fighting against the communists. So maybe world history taught some of that. A little bit complicated when we get into Asian history as well. As for our economy, how's our economy doing? How's the South doing? If you kind of remember the story of the Southern economy post King Cotton, it was struggling. Sharecropping South, the South is not industrializing. Then you got that Henry Grady guy who wants the new South. Well, this is finally the time where the South is able to industrialize. Why do they industrialize? Because of all of this federal spending, which you see is significant during the World War II years. A lot of this federal spending would be directed for like weapons factories in the South. So just kind of think your way through that. It is notable. Am I frozen here?